guy that was from the outback. If you know of Australia, in the outback, it was where they would have about 10,000 acres and probably about 4 cows. Well, they had more than that, but he was really a nice guy. And he was in North Africa, and when he came back to Sydney, he went AWOL, and you know what AWOL is?
Yep, running away from the military.
Anyway, and they broke him to a sergeant. And so he was a flying sergeant when I had him. And then that was in New Guinea when we were training. And then we took off from a little island called Wakti on our first mission to Borneo. And we got out, and we had a hard time transferring our gas tank in that B-24. They had twin gas tanks in front of they had a double Bombay. And so they put 2 tanks of gasoline in the front 2 tanks of Bombay, and then with bombs in the back. Well, we had a hard time transferring gas, so we ended up in tail end Charlie going on to the target. And you know what a tail end Charlie is?
No.
The last plane over. And just as we got off the target, about 20 or 30 Zeros aimed and tried to shoot us down.
20 to 30?
And they knocked out number 1 engine, which is to the right, the farthest engine, and they couldn't feather the prop, so it just windmilled. And so he couldn't turn much to the left, but he could turn to the right. And so after a while, when we were fighting the Japanese for about 20 minutes, while they left us, and we were on our own. And so he said, well, we can make it to the next island, which was the Celebes. And he said, do you want to ditch or bail out? And we didn't want to ditch. That was...
Explain to him what ditch, Harley, explain what ditch means.
Ditching means that you landed the plane in the ocean. So the pilot picked out this northern part of the Celebes where the Japanese weren't on. They owned the island. I mean, they were on the island, but they weren't on the north part. So the pilot said, well, we can pick out and bail here.
Keep going, Dad. Dad, keep going, Dad. Keep going, Dad.
What
Bail
happened?
out. What happened, Dad? Keep going.
Then, what we did, he came in probably about 5,000 feet. And so he said, well, now, half of you bail out, and then I'll turn around and the rest of you bail out. Well, it was on this Celebes Island, and these islands in the South Pacific had just real short mountains, and then you would fly over that and on this peninsula. And so half the crew landed on one side of that peninsula and half of it on the other side. I was in the first part, and I bailed out one of the first, and I was so light, I was one of the last ones to land. You could control your chute like you do today, but you could slip your airplane, a parachute, and you could, by slipping it on one side, you'd go the other way. So I landed in we were supposed to meet in a coconut grove. And so when we bailed out, I saw that I was going over the water, and so I directed myself enough, and I landed in a tree. So I never did hit the ground.
How did you get out? You cut yourself out?
Well, I just swung. When I landed in the tree, the parachute got caught in this tree about 50 feet from the ground, and I swung into the trunk, and then I climbed down from that. And so then we were meeting on the beach, and the coconut grove was about a half a mile on further. So here some of these guys, 4 or 5 of them landed in the water, or 4 of them, and another couple landed, so there was 5 of us. We had 11 on board the crew, and our navigator, we don't know really what happened to him. We think he probably was bailed out, but he drowned, we think, because we never did see him again. But I was in charge, I was an officer, so I had these other 4 guys with me. Until that made 5 of us, and we started off up the beach and to cross over and get into this coconut grove. So we got in, we bailed out about 11 o'clock in the morning, and then we got up to this coconut grove probably about noon or 1 o'clock, and then we spent the night there. And we were getting pretty hungry, and so I said, well, I can climb that coconut tree. I could climb anything at that time. And so I climbed up and got some of these coconuts, because green coconuts, you can live off of green coconuts because you can drink the milk and then eat the coconut. So I got up there, and all at once I started getting bit. And there was just a bunch of ants all over the place. No. And I slid down that tree and jumped in the water to get rid of the ants. But we lived that night on coconuts. And there was an old native hut there, just a foundation. So I suggested, well, we better have one guy on guard all night, or take turns, because we didn't know where the Japanese were at. So we stayed there that night, and then the next morning I found an old dugout canoe that the natives must have had, and I bailed all the water out of it, and we drank the water, but rainwater, but it was after we're scooping all the bugs off. And then I said, well, I'll go out fishing. So we always carried an emergency stuff in your pack, in your coveralls. And so I went out and tried to fish, and I couldn't get anything. So we came back, and then I said, well, we better build a fire and send up smoke in case because when we bailed out, we notified the Navy that had submarines and also flying cats. These are Catalina flying boats on patrol, because they knew that half the planes we took off would never get back. We knew that before we ever took off. So we sent out an SOS before we bailed out, and to about where we would be. And so about noon the next day, we saw this ship come into the bay, and we were in this cove. Water was only about 3 or 4 feet deep out there. And so as that ship came around the corner, there was a big white spot on the front, and I said, uh-oh, it's Japanese. So I told the guys, I said, you better stay out in the woods, because you could get in the jungle just a few 100 yards, and no one would ever find you. So as I got in there, and I said I'd stay on the beach. And so I was in my T-shirt, and all at once I saw these guys putting down a raft, and they came out with white T-shirts on, and I said, oh, it's the Navy. So I hollered to these guys, and our engineer was a guy, and he took off in the jungle because he thought I hollered Japanese or something.
Oh, no.
So these guys came in and with their rubber raft, and they said, all right, we've got to get out of here, because that ship was right sitting on the bottom out there, that submarine. And so I got everybody on board, and I said, well, where's Dutch? Oh, he's still out in the jungle.
Oh, no.
So we hollered and hollered, and finally he came out all scratched up. And he got on board this life raft, and there wasn't room for me, so I took this dugout canoe. And I said, I'll paddle out to that ship, the submarine. So I did, and when I got out on board that submarine, these Navy guys are the biggest scavengers in the world. They took that, I got on board the ship, and I just kicked that canoe loose. And one of the sailors grabbed that, and he said, oh, we want that for a souvenir. So they took that dugout canoe, was about 8 feet long, and shoved it down the conning tower and put it on board the sub.
How would you do that?
And he said, well, where's the rest of the crew? And I said, I think they're over on the other side of the mountain. So sure enough, the skipper went around and found them over there. And so we ended up in Perth, Australia. And I love the Aussies. They thought the Americans were about number one. Thank you.
What did you do while you were in Australia, Grandpa? Were you there for a while before
Oh, I
you
was there and I had a ball.
Did you go do some sailing?
We ended up in Perth, which is a submarine base, and these submariners treated us just like royalty. And of course the food was just superb, and we had steak and eggs for breakfast. Boy, that was really something. And then they had a USO, we were there 2 weeks, and they had a USO dance, and this one girl invited me the next day, this was on Saturday, and they said, I'll fix a picnic lunch, and we'll go out to Fremantle to the beach. I said, great. So she met me out in town, and we took the tram out from Perth out to Fremantle and had a picnic. And she was a nice girl. Her name was Patricia. But not that bad.
Dad, that was your first mission. So what did you do after the 2 weeks in
I was just on the, this was on October 3rd, 1943, and I had just turned 20.
Now, did you go back and where did you go back to? Where did you finish the rest of your missions?
After a while, we got our orders. Then our orders were to fly from Perth to Brisbane, Australia, and then from there fly over to New Guinea. So we ended up in New Guinea. I was in the hospital in Brisbane, Australia for 2 weeks, and there was a nurse there that, and she and her husband, she was a Portuguese gal married to an American soldier, and they were guerrillas in the Philippines, and the submarine had taken them out because she was sick or something happened, and they ended up in Brisbane at the hospital. So one day she was in town, and she said on this corner, she saw this guy and he looked so familiar, and she said, well, what's your name? And it was this girl's brother that had been in the Philippines all these 3 years, and she had lost track of him and thought maybe he had died or whatever. So anyway, that was a great adventure, and then they had a dinner for them. The nurses invited him to come out to see his sister. And so they had a party for us, and we were invited. And so one of the gals gave me a New Testament, and so they were Christian girls. And so I carried that the rest of my time. And then when we got back to New Guinea,
What, before you do that, explain why you were in the hospital. What were you being treated for,
I was
if anything?
being treated for anything except the fact that they would not let us go back until we had a complete physical. And I was in fine shape. The only thing is I had split my little finger when we were going into that coconut grove. We were crossing this little creek. And I said, well, I'll swim over and then you toss these flashlights and anything else that you didn't want to get wet. So they threw the flashlight over and I caught it on my little finger. And I should have gotten a Purple Heart, but I didn't. Well, then we got back into our outfit and they had moved up to Morotai, which is in the lower Philippines. And then I flew 39 more missions, and then I was discharged in a year later.
Grandpa, what were some of the favorite songs of the airmen that you flew with? What kind of music did you guys like?
Some of the favorite songs?
Yeah.
We used to listen to the Tokyo Rose, and she would always play these famous songs like, what is it?
Was Tokyo Rose?
Tell who Tokyo Rose was, Daddy. They probably don't know who
What?
she was.
Who's Tokyo Rose?
Who?
Oh, Tokyo Rose was a Japanese girl that had learned English in the United States. And she broadcast to the American soldiers, and she would always tell stories about and she knew where we were and our flights we were going to do and everything.
She was trying to help the Japanese government.
Propaganda.
Yeah, she was a
Propaganda, right. It was propaganda. But she was our favorite listener. I mean, we would listen to her. Well, the first few missions were pretty rough. And after about the fourth mission, the gunners decided they didn't want to fly anymore. So then we got a bunch of new gunners, and about 2 missions later, well, this one, the guys came over and they said, well, we want to fly again. So we took them all back, and so, but we had to substitute navigator all the rest of the time, and so.
How old was the people? How old were the guys, Daddy?
Our pilot was just 2 years older than I am, and then our co-pilot was, we call him Old Man, and he was 27.
Dad, what was the average day
Our
when
tail
you
gunner was Wingert, and he was just 18.
Wow.
Go, Mom.
Say,
Tell us your average day when you would, before you'd go on a mission. Tell us from the time you got up, when you got up, and what you would do.
Well,
and what your flying conditions were like, the
Yeah.
cold and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
we were flying every 3 days. So you would have 1 day off and then interrogate, and then you would fly the next day. And in between these times when I was off, I loved sailing, so I built a sailboat out of a P-38 gas tank. It was plywood. And I just
So that's as
had a
close as you
ball
came
of
to
it.
your P-38 then, isn't it?
And then one time I was out, I had a friend of mine. He was a weightlifter, and he had shoulders just about like Bruce. And so we were out about 2 miles from shore, and the wind came up, and I couldn't get back to shore. And I told this guy, I said, now when that wind comes, I'm going to turn around, because it was a sailboat. And I said, I want you to get from this outrigger to the next one. And just about when the wind hit, he was just crawling over and it tipped us over. The Navy guys were in there watching with their binoculars. And they said, well, those poor guys, after a while they felt sorry for us. We tried to get it righted up and couldn't. Every time we'd get it close, the wind would blow us over. So finally the guys said, well, we both better go rescue them. So what they did, they sent out this boat. I forget what it was. It was about a big rowboat. And I said, well, I want to keep my sailboat. So they threw a line to me, a rope. Navy guys call them lines. And so I hooked it on my sailboat, and I crawled in the boat with them. And he just turned that throttle wide open and snapped that line, and there went my sailboat. And I said, well, goodbye. I knew I was going to get home pretty soon. So that's the end of my sailing.
So how about your flying mission? Talk about you would meet in your war room, not your war room, but
interrogation.
when you guys were getting briefed, your briefing room. And then, can you talk about that? And then talk about what your day, the normal flight day was like, from
well, we
after
usually, most of our missions were about 15 hours. And so we'd get up early in the morning to fly.
To go into your
after
briefing first, right?
We briefed the day before of our target. Our job for the 13th Air Force was to knock out all the airfields in the area so the Japanese could not send their fighters out. And so our job was to keep the airfields knocked out. So during the briefing, they give us a pretty good description of what we were to bomb. And so we would take off, and then on our bombing mission, we'd probably take off about 3 o'clock in the morning, just before daylight. And then we would fly to the target. And then after the target, you dropped your bombs, then we would find our way back. And usually you flew in one-man formation.
Which was why would you do that?
One of the reasons, because you could cover more targets.
Were you safer from attack from enemy fighters that way as well?
No, the first few missions we still had quite a few enemy fighters to contend with, but in the meantime, we had bombed Malapapan oil refinery and burned it to the ground, and so the Japanese didn't have any fuel, very little fuel for their airplanes. So what they would do is limit their flying because of the lack of fuel. So we didn't run into very many fighters from then on.
Dad, what about in the morning when you first came out? You said there was a blackboard and you'd have all the crews, and you knew that half of them wouldn't return.
You would always be assigned to a flight. And a lot of our targets...
Explain what a flight was to these guys. Unless they're flyers, they won't know what a flight is.
Well, a flight is a mission when you go on their mission.
So
okay, I'm talking too much about my war years.
Yeah, we want to hear it. I already have
the whole rest of his life.
I have somebody from the World War II Museum who wants this. He's going to be in Seattle, and
I interviewed with him one time.
Well, Grandma, tell us about when you met Grammy then.
Wait, I have one more question. When you got up in the morning to go on your mission, you said that you'd see all the names of all the flights, and you knew that half of them wouldn't come back. Isn't that right?
Well, that was on our first mission.
So, but wasn't all the missions that way?
No, not all of them. When I was gone for about pretty near 6 weeks when I was shot down in Australia, and then the hospital, and then before I got back. So the war had really moved ahead during that 6-week period. A lot of the islands had been taken in New Guinea and the surrounding area, and so the Japanese were still on the Philippines and on Borneo, but they weren't very active, and so we were able to be able to protect ourselves pretty well. And then all we did was drop our bombs.
Did you
Then in let's see, that was in 1944, before the end of the war, in August, just at the end of the war, I came back to the States. And then I knew that I could be discharged. So I enlisted in Gonzaga University in Spokane and stayed with my family. This was in 1944, 45. And so I enlisted in Gonzaga in the fall and then started my engineering training.
Grandpa, what about the day the war was over?
Oh, when the war was over, I was still in getting discharged and getting ready to go to Gonzaga.
Did you have any
the
big
war
parties?
was over in August. And so school was starting just that fall. And so I was able to go to school when the war had ended.
How did you get finance to go to school?
Oh, well, the government was really nice about education, and they gave us a GI Bill, which was $75 a month. They would pay for our books and tuition. And out of the $75, you had to find your own board and room. And so I stayed with my folks until 1947, when my dad and Howard and Marty and I, Dad heard down in Sunnyside, Washington, Ready Mix that was being for sale.
Do you know what the name of that company was at that time?
I don't remember the name of that company, but they were a couple young men that started that, and they had 3 old mixers. And they were, what?
I have a question after you finish. I have a question when you're finished talking.
Okay. So then we ended up in 1947. My dad and Mom moved to Sunnyside, Washington to start the Ready Mix. And I stayed in Spokane with my grandmother until they could sell that farm on 5 Mile. And then we moved to, then the folks, when they sold that, then Grandma went and moved down with Mom and Dad in Sunnyside. And so then I was on my own, and so we rented a boarding room from different places. And I had a roommate that was also a World War II vet. And he had a lame leg because he got beat up in the service. And so then I finished Gonzaga in 1945. 49.
49.
You're about right.
And during that time, I dated a few girls, and then in 1948, I met this girl up on 5 Mile. There was a neighbor, and she was Pat's sister. She was a tomboy, and she loved to play softball and everything, and I love kids. So I played softball with her, and finally she said, well, you better meet my sister.
That was Wilma, wasn't it, Daddy?
And but didn't register anything because she was just a young girl. And then one day I was during summer school, I was at Gonzaga, and then going home to 5 Mile Prairie, I saw this girl walking around the road going home, and it was Pat. So I picked her up and took her home, and I said, would you like to go to a show? And she said, well, I'll have to ask my mom. She was only 17.
Oh, well, I just thought I'd been talked to what I was going to do.
Anyway, so her mom said, oh yes, he's just like a big brother. She was dating a guy that was in Alaska, wasn't he? Huh? He was in the service. Anyway, we had a good time, but I didn't date her anymore because I thought she was too young.
That's not the truth.
Well, then we started dating, and she was in Meade High School, and Marty graduated in Meade year before, and Marty had a date with Pat. And
Tell about Uncle Marty's car.
and took her to the show at the Fox Theater, and Marty was just about shorter than I am, and he drove out of that parking lot and hit a curb or something, and Pat fell right against the dashboard and knocked. And that was the last Marty dated Pat. Then I started dating her. They had a, what is it called? Tolo?
Now, you're a little bit mixed up on that timing, honey. I asked you to go to a Tolo when I was a sophomore, just because I wasn't dating anybody at the time. So, I thought I'd ask you. My very good friend, another neighbor girl, Mary Lou Granger, asked you also to the same Tolo, but I happened to call you first. And my sister, Wilma, said, why don't you call Harley? Because I didn't know who to ask, so I did. And then for a whole year, because I was still 16 and you were 22, I was just still a little girl. I mean, you didn't notice me at all. That was okay. I wasn't intending, but he actually, when he picked me up, I had to work all day at this downtown store, go on the bus, clear to the end of the line, and I don't know if anything you know where Spokane where Francis is. And I walked along Francis all the way along, quite
It
a
was
long
about
way.
3.5 miles.
I walked after going in working the store till 6 and on the bus, going up, and I walked all the way along Francis and up a hill, how many miles? About 3.5 miles. And we didn't have any heavy set girls in my day. Usually there was one car in the family, and one walk.
They're everywhere. Yeah.
Just walk.
Ride home. And the next week, I was working at the laundry, no, the scarf, right in the front of the store. And here comes Harley and his friend Dean Bladen. And it was 1 week later that she came all the way from Sunnyside. You were working with your folks in the summertime. You came a week later and asked me if we could have a double date with my girlfriend Eleanor. We went up to the lake and then we started dating. From then I was just going into my senior year now.
And then later on, it got pretty serious.
Grandpa, when the war was over, was there a lot of dancing in the streets in Spokane?
Is there what?
When the war was over in 1945, was there a lot of dancing in the streets?
Oh man, I was still in California when they celebrated.
Oh.
And boy, there was a parties all over the place. Yeah, those pictures are pretty true of what happened. Okay?
Okay. Okay.
Here's a story that some of the younger kids might get a kick out of. You want to tell that story about how the house almost on 5 Mile, how you and Dad almost got the house caught on fire with the I think it had to do with the heated rocks in the bed or something like that. Yeah, refresh my memory.
And I slept on the second floor of this rental house on 5 Mile Prairie. And in the wintertime, you know how cold it gets in Spokane. So Bruce, Howard decided, well, the bed was so cold, he took this extension cord with a light bulb on it and put it under the covers, and we both went to sleep, and pretty soon...
You guys were a couple of engineers, right?
No, we weren't engineers at that time.
How old were you at that time?
This was, I was in probably about junior in high school.
Oh.
Well, what incident was it where the bed mattress actually got thrown out of the window?
Oh,
I
yeah.
think that was the house.
my grandmother slept
the
in
mattress
the
on
next
fire.
bedroom, and she smelled that fire, the smoke, and she called my dad, and he went running upstairs and threw that bedding out the window, and Howard and I, when it started burning, all we did was just move over to the side of the bed. We didn't,
It was so cold.
Because it was cold, Dad?
it was cold, but Dad threw that out, and then I don't know what happened, but we slept in another place where there was covers.
And how did that particular mattress get caught on fire?
With that light bulb.
That was the light bulb incident. Okay. And then you guys also used to you guys would heat up rocks, wouldn't you, and take those to bed with you,
No,
keep
we
by
would
your
heat
feet?
up brick.
Or bricks.
Is that how the pig caught on fire?
Well,
The what?
there was a fire in your hog shed one time, and tell about how the pigs they lost all their hair.
That was when we were in Nebraska.
They took the pigs in the house.
In that A-frame house, my dad raised pigs. And this old sow had a bunch of pigs. It was about in early part of February, and it was still pretty cold. And the old sow had dug down, and Dad had made out of old gas tank, two welded together, and used it for a heater, and he'd heat the ground underneath that hog house. And so that sow got some straw down there, and it got on fire and burned her sow up, and all but two pigs. And these two pigs escaped, and they had burns down all the back of them. And my mom raised those little pigs on a bottle, and they became pets.
Tell about when
you
your
ate
mom
'em.
would be gone and the pigs would get in the house. Those two
Oh, yeah,
pigs. They
these
always
pigs were
trying to
just
get
like,
they were trying to get in the house again, weren't they, Dad?
they'd try to get in, yeah.
Then you ate them, right?
Huh?
Then you ate them when they got older, right?
Not those two pigs. We wouldn't eat those.
Really?
They were too much of a pet.
Spared from the fire. Tell them about your Christian heritage, where it came from, and what
Oh,
about your life.
my grandmother and my mom were really devout Christians. And so when we were on 5 Mile, even in Nebraska, Mom would bring, my dad would be busy during farming, and so Mom would take the old Ford and us 3 boys to Sunday school and church. And we met about 2 or 3 miles from home in an old schoolhouse. It was a converted schoolhouse that we would have church in. And so we would meet there, and my mom was really a committed Christian, and her mother was a member of the ACLU,
No, that's the Women's Christian Temperance. Yeah,
Christian Temperance Union, in Hastings, Nebraska. And she would take and go with a bunch of women into these taverns and just raise Cain. Oh, she didn't like that.
Was that
So anyway, I was sitting in church one Sunday, and I was probably about 4 years old, and had it was hot, so the window was down, and I had my hand on that windowsill, and all at once that window came down right during the sermon, and I let out a scream and hollered, and my mom took me out. You better be quiet. And then my grandmother, of course, was a devout Christian, so that's why I had an inheritance of Christianity, and so it really stuck with me. Howard was a little bit ambivalent about that, but when he was first married, he used to take those kids to Sunday school, and he and Laverne.
Grandpa,
Yep.
tell about how your grandmothers, both your grandmas, lived with you, and how you would hide behind your grandmas so you wouldn't get in trouble.
Grandma was pretty protective, and so whenever she was around, we'd use her for a shield.
That was your grandma,
Which grandma
That
was
was
that?
my
which one?
mom's mother.
What was her name?
Howard, Grandma Howard.
And
What do you
Dad's mother was a widow, and his dad died when he was only 12 or 13 years old. So she raised all the rest of those kids by herself. And Dad, they lived in Nebraska, and she had this dairy farm out not too far from Hastings, and they would have you know, in those days they had bottled milk. And so Dad would, Howard would take with his uncle, and they would deliver milk. And they had a horse named Lady. And this lady knew the route so well that they'd cut across the street or in the alley, and that horse would meet them around in front. And that horse lived to be 35 years old. And that's the horse I learned to ride on.
Oh, which grandparent was this, Dad? Which one was this? Your dad, your mom's dad?
No, my dad's dad.
Okay.
My dad's mother had this dairy.
So what was her name? Do you remember?
Anna. No, that was Aurelia.
Yes.
Aurelia Drollinger?
Yep.
Aurelia Drollinger? And what do you remember about your mom's? Didn't your grandpa have a store?
Grandpa,
Your mom's parents.
my mom's dad had a general store in Kennesaw, Nebraska. And so he had that store. And then my grandmother was a school teacher. His first wife, they either died or divorced, and he met her in church.
She died.
And so they got married, and then they moved after the girls were born. My mom and her sister were born. Then he sold that and moved to Hastings, Nebraska. This was in Kennesaw, a little town about 30 miles from Hastings. And
Daddy,
Tell us about the store.
Tell your story about your grandpa and grandma tricked him with the eggs. The chicken egg story.
That's really a story. I don't know if you, well, I told most of you, but my grandfather, my mother's dad, had the general store in Hastings and Kennesaw. And when his customers would come in, he was always bragging about his chickens laying eggs. And so my grandmother said, well, I'll fix that. So she would, when he'd go gather the eggs, she'd always take some back out. And so finally she had those chickens, each one laying an egg a day. And it kept on for about a week. And he was bragging about all the customers about how well those chickens laid eggs. And then she said, oh my, what am I going to do about, I can't keep taking legs out there. So finally she just decided she'd not take as many out each time, and finally got it back to where the chickens laid their normal eggs. And she never would tell him what happened. And he was a full-blooded Englishman, and my grandmother was full-blooded Dane, and used to play tricks on him all the time.
Was he the one that used to have the smoked cigars and they'd be up above in the store?
In the office.
They had an office?
No,
Didn't
he
have all
had
his
an
friends?
office in Hastings, Nebraska. And I would go down when I'd visit him in Hastings and go down to this office, he called it. And it was so full of cigar smoke I could hardly stand it. Well, one day he was out going to the drugstore in Hastings and fell down right on the street and had a heart attack.
But what? Tell about his politics.
Oh, he was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat.
Was he a representative? Dad?
And he had a den. And during election time, when we'd go visit, boy, you didn't bother him. He was so involved in the radio, listening to the politics. And so we could not go into his room. He called it his den.
Who was president then? Do you remember who he wanted?
This was the early part of Roosevelt.
In the 20s or 30s?
Yeah,
The
Roosevelt had an 8-year term.
30s.
Not Theodore, it was,
Right.
I mean,
Frankfurt.
not Teddy Roosevelt, but Theodore Roosevelt.
Was didn't
Oh, Franklin
Yeah, Franklin.
Roosevelt.
The same name.
wasn't it your granddad, that same guy? Didn't he own one of the first cars in Nebraska?
I'm not sure. I think he probably did. He loved cars. And one time when I was just in we were in Spokane in 1937. And that summer I got to go to Hastings, Nebraska, all by myself on the train. And so I took the train. Mom and Dad put me on the train in Spokane, and I went clear to North Platte, Nebraska on the train. From there I had to switch trains and go to Hastings, Nebraska, which is North Platte from Hastings was about less than 100 miles. And so I got to Hastings, Nebraska, and Grandpa had an Essex with a rumble seat in it. And one day he went out and kicked those tires and he said, Harley, I think you better go down and take this car and have the tires checked. Well, the service station was about 3 blocks away.
How old were you, Dad?
I was probably 12 years old. And so I said, boy, yeah. So I car and went down there. I had my tonsils out that summer.
Oh, tell him what you did.
What?
Tell him what you did after your tonsils were out.
Oh, after I had my tonsils out, there was a little community grocery store about, probably 6 blocks away from my grandmother's house. So they laid me on the couch. This is a one-day operation. You just go in the doctor, they take out your tonsils, and then you'd send you home. So here I was recovering at home at my grandmother's house, and laying on the couch. Grandma left, and so I thought, well, I'm going down and get a candy bar or an ice cream or something at the grocery store. So I went down there, and here I could hardly walk. And I walked all the way down there and got back. My grandmother wanted to know where I was.
Big trouble.
And I couldn't eat it.
To jump forward a little bit, can you talk about that story about when you guys moved as a family out here from Nebraska? And I remember hearing about how your dad drove the car. It was wintertime, I think, when you were coming out here from Nebraska, and he drove the car into a snowbank.
Not Howard. He wasn't driving.
No, I mean your dad. Your dad.
My dad. And then he got sleepy, and so he said to my mom, I said, well, you better drive. And so Mom said, oh, sure, I can drive. We were in western Wyoming, and the roads were slick and ice, and Mom hit a slick spot, and we tipped over on the edge of the road in the snowbank. And here we were, 3 of us, and boys, in this old Ford.
What kind of Ford?
Everything we had.
What kind of
What
car
kind of
was
Ford?
Ford.
Ford what?
Probably about early Model A.
So now you got snow on the ground, right? Cold, and you guys are at the side of the road. And talk about the road system back then. You know how they compared to what they're not like they are today.
Well,
but what happened to your story then?
Like. Anyway, people came by and helped us right that car back up. It didn't hurt anything. And so we checked the oil and checked everything. We got in and drove all the way to Spokane.
And what did the road look like that you were driving on? Describe it.
Just rode out in front of the house.
About like that. That was considered a highway back then, wasn't it?
Oh, yes.
In your driveway, Daddy?
Like a gravel. They didn't have the state
Gravel.
patrol or anything.
Like a gravel road?
It was a gravel road, Grandpa?
No, it was paved.
Okay.
So like the road that goes past your driveway. Is that what you mean?
On Maple Way.
Maple Way?
On Maple Way.
Yeah, okay.
I didn't think they paved back then.
Right.
But there were not very
And
many
then-
roads.
There's one other thing that when you were at school, tell us about when you went to school when you were little. Wasn't there snowstorms in Nebraska, and there was times where, tell us about going to school.
I can remember some of my grade school teachers. We had this one lady that was they could get their teaching certificate when they were 18. She was probably about 19 years old and weighed about 250 pounds. And she was up there, and at about 11 o'clock, 11:30 in the morning, I sat in the front because I was little, and all at once I saw a trickle of water coming out from underneath her desk out toward us. And so and we knew we hadn't better laugh. And so what we did, she said, well, you kids can go out for for noon early. So she let us all go out, and we peeked through the window and saw her cleaning up that mess.
Daddy, what about that snowstorm?
Yeah, the snowstorm.
Where the electric lines were. You were walking over the fences and everything.
Oh, yeah.
To
we
get
used
home, how did you get?
In the wintertime, it was too cold to ride horses, so we'd walk to school, and we'd walk across these fence lines, and they would drift. The snow would drift over the fences, and so we could just walk right over them.
How about shoveling to the barn? How did you do your chores in that deep snow?
They what?
How did you do your chores with that deep snow? Did you have to tunnel to the barn, or how did you manage with
Yeah,
all that
we'd
snow?
shovel on the way to the barn, and we'd always put the livestock in the barn.
Yeah.
So our job was to shovel out the manure.
What about going to North Central High School? Tell them what you did then.
And how far you guys would travel, you and Dad would
Hours
travel
at
by
night.
bicycle down there or
We'd
walk.
go 7 miles from 5 miles to North Central High School, and we would ride our bikes, except in the wintertime. Then we would go early, and Dad would go to work. And so we would get to North Central High School probably about 7:30 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and before anybody else was there, and we would just have the run of the schoolhouse, and so that's what we would do. But ordinarily, we would either ride our bikes or walk, or
Talk about the elevation change that these guys don't all
it was
know.
just like over there on that mountain over there, that was about like 5 miles. Up on top was the plateau
Where you guys lived.
and where we lived. So we'd always have to crawl up and down that hill. And going down that mountain, or the hill, we called it the South Hill, I'd ride my bike and I'd lay down on the seat so I'd be more streamlined. And one time the neighbor clocked me doing 60 miles an hour going down that hill.
Oh my gosh.
I believe it.
And it wasn't paved.
Oh no.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, that was a long, hard slog coming back. You know, in the
Oh,
winter
we
time,
always
up all
have
that
to push our
elevation
bike.
change.
Push our bikes back up the hill.
Did you ever have a newspaper route?
Oh yes, I had a newspaper route, and I delivered the Spokane Press. And I had about 12 customers, and I would take this horse and deliver papers. And that was my job, and I earned probably about $1 a week delivering papers.
And where would you deliver them?
Just right around the neighbors.
What about
I'd take my horse down to pick up the papers, and then go up the east hill and drop off the papers around the neighborhood.
Did Carl Wojan do that with you, or what were some of your friends?
Carl Wojan was a neighbor of mine. He ended up as a vice president with Mattel Toy Company. He graduated and moved from Spokane to Hillsboro, Oregon, and he became a food technologist or something like that. Got his first job as a bird's eye in food control, and ended up with
Quality control.
huh?
It was quality control.
Yeah, quality control. Anyway, he ended up, and they ended up with he married a girl that he met as a stewardess on one of his flights that he'd go on.
Think of anything else?
That's about enough, isn't it?
Well, I was gonna say, so Grandpa,
Huh?
when you got married to Grammy, did you guys stay in Spokane, and what did you do?
Oh, well,
And when
we
did you
moved, when we got married in 49, I graduated from college in 49, and then Pat was, that year had gone to PLU, and so she would just turn 19 in July, and then we were married in August 14th.
Yep.
And so you got married, and then did you stay in Spokane?
Oh, and then we moved, when we got married, we built a house in Prosser, Washington, out of block.
Why did you move to Prosser?
What?
Why did you move to Prosser?
Well, that's where we were in the ready-mix business in the Lower Valley.
Okay.
And so we put a ready-mix down in Prosser, and I ran that while Pat and I were first married, before we had any children.
Dad, tell about building your house out of blocks.
What?
You know, the cement.
That was quite an adventure. The house didn't have any insulation in, so in the wintertime, and single glass, it was pretty cold in the wintertime. And drafty. One time we lived just about 2 or 3 blocks from downtown in Prosser, and the Princess Theater had a good movie on, and so Pat and I, during the wintertime, you didn't receive any salary from the ready-mix, but you didn't do any ready-mix.
Just in January only.
In January. So this January we had this movie down there, and I told Pat, I said, well, wouldn't it be nice to go to a movie? And we had, at that time when we first got married, we put all of our money, paychecks, in this little coffee tin. Muffin tin. And in one where we had a recreation, well, we didn't have any money left. So I said, well, what are we going to do? And so we scrounged around the house, finally found enough money, and I think it only cost us 25 cents a piece to go to the show. And we found enough money, and we went and walked to the theater, and we thought we were little kids again.
Dug in the Davenport and all that kind of stuff.
We dug in the Davenport, in the bedroom.
And Grandma lived with you then, didn't she? Didn't your great grandma live? No. Didn't she?
What?
No, the grandparents
No, Grandma
in
lives
those
with
days,
Grandpa.
and Grandma Howard
Right.
and his other grandma that I never met were such wonderful ladies. They didn't go to nursing homes. At least Grandma Howard had to at the very last one. She was not well at all. But she had these 2 wonderful daughters, Virginia and Marvel. And they took turns going to their grandma. Howard took turns with 2 daughters to stay with them. And they were helps. They were just wonderful people to have. And so you never had to worry about what was going to happen to them.
And then Dad's mother was a widow lady, and so she would take turns. She had 8 kids, 4 with her first husband that had, and then she had 4 with him. And so she would take turns staying with each one of these families, and then so that's how they stayed. They didn't go to a retirement home or anything. They stayed with the family.
What I thought was wonderful about Grandma Drollinger is she was single, never been married. She met Harley's grandfather, who also went to church. He had the 4 children. He had these 4 children, and his wife had died. They weren't raised yet. So this girl married this man with 4 kids. Wonderful lady. And then they had 4 more together themselves. So she raised his 4 and they're together 8 children. And she was a wonderful Christian lady too.
So my dad had 2 stepsisters, 2 stepbrothers, and then 2 full sisters, and then a full brother, Jake.
Uncle Harley, going back to your Gonzaga days, your most famous alumni up there was Bing Crosby. And Bing Crosby, my understanding of the story I heard growing up was how Fred, your Uncle Fred, was older than Bing Crosby, and he lived down there next to Gonzaga University. And you can correct me on anything I'm wrong on, because my memory's a little fuzzy on this. But and of course, I wasn't living through those days. That's why I want you to talk about it. But the story I had heard, like through Dad, is that Bing Crosby and Fred, Bing Crosby knew great Uncle Fred, your Uncle Fred, and
I don't know anything about that.
Oh, well, I'd heard that Bing Crosby was kind of a wild guy, in his youth, and would drink frequently and get drunk, and he would pass out on Uncle Fred's front porch.
Is that Dad? Do you remember that?
You remember any of those stories? You remember hearing any of that?
Where did you hear that from your dad?
Mm-hmm.
So Grandpa did, so you moved to Prosser and had the Ready Mix company, and you were working there. Is that where Aunt Wilma Lee was born?
Yes.
They did what?
Yes. We lived in Prosser 2.5 years after we were married. She was born in the Prosser Hospital a few blocks from where we lived. And she was born, she was supposed to come in January, about the second or third week in January, and my doctor was going on vacation, so he said, and his resident doctor was working with him also at the same time. He said, she's ready to be born, so he had me go to the hospital on the 18th of December and had induced labor and used everything, and she wouldn't come, she wasn't ready. But he tore open my bag of water, so she had to come quickly. And the poor little thing, if they hadn't had an airlock, they call it those times, where it took the mucus out of the lungs, she wouldn't have made it. She was turned, they'd have called her a blue baby. They had something that took, she was born on a Monday, and I didn't get to see her only once until Friday, because she had to have oxygen and stay in the incubator. She was only 3 weeks early, but she wasn't ready to be born. So and he did that to address it, and he lost his license a year later, the doctor did. So when I was expecting Bruce, I drove around to Prosser, 150 miles away. So, but it was, was a good decision.
And so you
That, Ann and Marty were married the year before we were.
Yes, we were honored to be
It's your
their
video.
best man and maid of honor. And they had a precious wedding, and it was at her parents' home, and lots of beautiful apple blossoms decorating, and we've been best of friends ever since, haven't we?
You guys had a lot of get-togethers through the company, didn't you? Weren't there company picnics, and did you guys spend a lot of time together and the cousins played together?
We love that swimming pool, right?
Dad,
David?
Dad, can you tell about
Yeah.
can you tell about working for Valley Ready Mix and the company and the get-togethers and the family? Who worked with you?
Dad was the owner of that Valley Ready Mix. And us boys just worked for him, and finally, after several years, he decided to make it into a company, and so we were part of the company then.
And you worked with your brothers.
Yeah, Howard and I and Marty were part of the company.
Talk about when you decided
And then
to
we
go.
had we were in Prosser about pretty near 10 years. First of all, in 1956, in Prosser, we decided we wanted to go into mission work, and so we went to Seattle to LBI, Lutheran Bible Institute, and we were there. And then I was looking for a job, and I got a job for Boeing, and they gave me a special shift. I could go to work at 10 o'clock and work till 6. And so I would go to LBI with Pat in the morning and then I'd jump in the car and I'd head for work, and then I'd get off at 6 o'clock.
What was one of the reasons you left the family business, Dad? Did you have a hard time working with your own dad, or what?
Dad was pretty domineering, and so.
Harley, the reason why we left is because we thought we were
Oh
going
yeah, we thought we were going into mission
What
work.
made you decide to do that, Grandpa? Why did you decide to do mission work?
Well, we were real active in the Lutheran Church in Grandview for years, and we were league sponsors, Luther League kids. And so we would work on these kids, and we would have 20 kids or 25 kids, and we'd take them up to Rimrock Lakes and different places. And so we were so involved with young people. And then when we moved to Richland, then I worked with the young people, the junior high kids. And so we thought with our experience, and then with what we wanted to do, we thought we'd go into mission work. Then when I was at seminary,
but that was later.
Did you keep your shares in the company business, or how did that work? Did you keep
what?
Did you keep your shares in the company in the business?
No, when we decided to go into the ministry in 1962, 62, why Dad said, all right, if you're going to leave, I'm going to give you $40,000.
Oh no,
75,000. So that was my share, and I didn't. He said, and then you don't get any shares in the company. He said, you're just out. So I said, fine.
And so that left Howard and Marty.
So that left Howard and Marty.
It was hard on the family and hard on, it was a real.
Dad was really unhappy with me because I left the business.
And so that's when you went to Seattle to LDI, or
See, you got that mixed up.
Well, that's when he went to seminary, isn't it?
You moved to Dubuque in '62, didn't you? Right after I was born.
Yeah.
Harley, I need to clarify this. We were only in Seattle for a little over a year.
About a year and a half.
We left our home in Prosser for sale, reasonably. We thought it was very reasonable price, but we couldn't sell it. And we thought, Lord, if you want us to go into mission work, we can't go unless that house is sold. So after we were there at school for a year, we thought, we'll have to go back to the job, which we did. We worked
56.
56. So we stayed in the business until 1961. And then Harley felt that he definitely should go into the ministry. He felt called to go. And I had the same feeling that we should do this. We had a wonderful business opportunity. We had a good relationship with Howard and Marty, and we loved our Hardy's folks. They were so good to us, but we just felt that this is what God wanted us to do. So we severed all ties then in 61, and in 62
That's enough.
we enrolled. Yeah, we enrolled in where they used to get clear pictures.
You didn't tell the story about moving to Dubuque and taking the ponies and the ponies
Oh, well,
escaping
that's
and
a
all
whole
that.
different story.
Okay.
Grandpa's getting tired.
We'll do the next one later, another
Next
time.
installment.
But
The
he-
grilling
then
will
we moved
continue.
We moved to Dubuque in 62 and enrolled. It's normally a 4-year course, but he had so much church. He helped build a church in Grandview. The ready mix, the company supplied the concrete for that church, for the church in Sunnyside, and Harley's dad really committed his life to the Lord. I mean, he went regular. It was a wonderful commitment, and so. We went back, but we felt we'd go back to Dubuque. 3 wonderful years, as the kids remembered. Then we took a call to that little church in Idaho. We were there 9 years, and then came back to Yakima in 74. You didn't hear it. And we were thinking see if God wanted us to take another church. But in that first year and a half we were there, for a couple of years,
with their meeting
All
where?
three parents. We have lost three parents. His dad, my mother, and dad all died within 18 months of each other. So we knew why God didn't call him to another. The church didn't want us to leave Potlatch. They really wanted us to stay. We felt that it was our time to go. And so when we came to Yakima and all this happened, we knew why God wanted us to come to Yakima. Because we were needed by our family and we needed to
Kept waiting for another call and couldn't get one.
Well, that's why, because God wants to be here,
Yeah.
especially for our parents.
So that's our life story. We're here.
So much. So Diane has dessert ready. So what? How many people would like coffee or what other things? What would we like? Let me
Is there
find
coffee
out.
made?
Let me find out. Who would like coffee if there's coffee? A lot of coffee.
Dave.
We can make some coffee. What else?